Good morning. Welcome to the 27th meeting of the Latin America Shadow Financial Regulatory Committee. Too long in English, very short in Spanish, CLAF. This time, I think you have the bios with you, and you have the names, so I don't think there is a need for an introduction. All the bios are at the entrance, as well as the statement. I hope you have all picked up the statement. For those of you that have not been with us before, let me just tell you a few words about CLAF. We are a group of about 14 economies from Latin America that meet twice a year and for 3 days and produce a statement about a topic that is very relevant for the region. This is our 27th meeting. We've been, this is the first time that Guillermo Perry joins us. So, hola Francisco, you can put in adelante. Some of us, not all of us meet in the same meeting. Carmen Reinhardt was not able to join us for the presentation. There's a rotation of people that can come according to available schedules. But this is shared by the entire committee membership. And this time, the topic that we are going to discuss is something close, very much close to the heart of Latin America, which is the need for liquidity. We had to add, of course, in time of stress, since that's when liquidity is needed the most. So basically what we have, and again, I hope you have the statement, is the recognition. We start with a very clear recognition that since the 90s, Latin America has recognized, as many other emerging market economies, that accumulation of reserves is a must. They have to have it because if you face a crisis, even built for any reason, but if you face a crisis, then liquidity is what gets you first, and you need to accumulate reserves. And by now, by mid-2012, Latin America is doing a very good job. They have already reserves that exceed 700 billion, out of which, and it's important, dollars. And it's, of course, to point out that about half of this is Brazil. So the importance of Brazil in the region is manifested not only by its size, but of course by accumulation of reserves. Now, why, in addition to what I just said, we care so much about that international reserves? Is because the components of international reserves are usually, and there should be, what is called safe assets. Assets that are international traded, that are very liquid, like the U.S. Treasury bills and bonds is a good example. And the reason why we care about so much about safe assets is because they usually are used as collateral for international credit transactions. And as in the crisis, international crisis, liquidity dries, then credit crunches follow. Okay? Now, there are many discussions about why to hold reserves, but international reserves, but we are focusing, this statement is focused on the precautionary role of international reserves. So the central question is, if you have to hold reserves, how do you hold it? What is the component of your reserve? How do you actually make a decision about reserves? And the question is very relevant because holding reserves, as you know, is not free, right? I mean, if you hold it in Treasury, U.S. Treasury bills, and the interest rate is so low as it is right now, there's a huge cost. There's a huge opportunity cost of holding reserves. So countries hold reserves on their own because it's hard to get them to get liquidity at the time of a crisis. Ideally, if you think of a perfect world, liquidity could be available through a global lender of last resort. That you need liquidity and it functions like a central bank functions with banks. But that doesn't exist. And right now, the current international financial architecture is formed by, well, the national central banks that provide liquidity locally to their banks, and multilateral institutions such as the IMF and the IMF first, right? Because this as an institution for provision of liquidity, but also follows, of course, the other multilateral organizations such as the IDB, the World Bank, and we cannot forget the very important role that the credit swaps, bilateral swap arrangements with the Federal Reserve and other foreign banks plays in this process. So what we think is that it's not enough for Latin America to just have as a source of liquidity the painful and long process of trying to get it through the external arrangements at the global level. We think there is value in thinking about regionally what can be done. And for that, the committee proposes the establishment of what we call an LALF, a Latin America Liquidity Fund. Okay? It will basically have two functions. First is liquidity provision to the public sector, and second is lending to mitigate volatility in trade credit. I'm also going to quickly mention a third function that is basically the setting up an administration of a regional stabilization fund for commodity prices to help us to smooth out the volatility of commodity prices. So, to repeat, the main role of this LALF is liquidity provision. Now, we need to make an estimation of how large or how small should this fund be. So what we did was the following. We took the needs of the Latin American region in the previous crisis, in the global financial crisis. And about the region as a whole had net liquidity needs of about $100 billion. Okay? So based on that number, starting with that number, we thought that part of that liquidity needs was satisfied in many ways, right? But for a regional fund, if we had a minimum, the size of a fund with a minimum capital contribution of about $25 billion, expandable to 50 billion, and assuming that over that initial capital contribution there could be a leverage ratio of 2, right? Meaning that the fund could actually use its capital to borrow in the international capital markets, that capitalization will provide the LALF a minimum lending capacity of that, $100 billion, which was what the countries needed in the previous crisis, okay? Now, to put this in context, let me tell you that those $50 billion that we are talking about, the size of the LALF, is very much in line with what the Chiang Mai initiative in Asia is actually doing. Because it just happened that this is equivalent to about 3.5% of total international reserves. And that's about the same equivalent as the Chiang Mai initiative. So we're in the same ballpark. So this doesn't sound crazy. This is, of course, these initial numbers is just what the committee did on a kind of a back of an envelope calculation, right? I mean, it's still not a certain number, but to give you an idea whether it's feasible, okay, and whether it makes sense. Now, with $100 billion lending capacity, that doesn't mean that the fund, the LALF, will be able to satisfy the liquidity needs of all the region. It will satisfy the liquidity needs of all the small and medium-sized countries, and a part of the large economies such as Brazil and Mexico. But to be realistic, there's no way that a fund can be created to satisfy the needs of the largest countries. The largest countries at the same time are the ones that have the most available resources from the Fed credit lines from the IMF. So we need to be thinking about that context, that large and small countries are not the same for the creation and the utilization of the fund resources. Now, how will this fund work? First of all, liquidity has to be there when you need it. It's not a question that you have to start applying for liquidity. No, it's too late. Then you die in the process. So we have a two-step process of accessing liquidity. First is that in the first tranche, basically what you have contributed to the fund, you can take out with no conditionality whatsoever, no question asked. That's yours. And as a result, it needs to count at all times as part of your international reserves. Okay? The second tranche needs pre-qualification. Let me explain this a little bit. When countries join, and through all the time of their membership, we need to put in the fund, we are advising that this fund has a number of preconditions to pre-qualify to liquidity. If you pre-qualify, then that's it. Then the next time when you have a need, you don't have to ask for permission. You just go and take the resources. Now, this is going to depend how much resources you can take. It's going to depend of the size of the country. Again, if you are remember, in the first tranche, you can take everything you can have put on. But in the second tranche, the resources that you are able to withdraw are between 100 and 200% of a member capital contribution, depending on size.
Inversely, depending on size.
Right. Inversely, I was going to clarify that. With the smaller countries being the one that can actually withdraw more, right? So in other words, if you are Colombia, you are a medium-sized country, you can withdraw up to 200%. If you are Brazil, you can withdraw up to 100%. Okay? So, of course, you think about this as Brazil and Mexico, the large countries, being net creditors to the fund. So this pre-qualification, going back to this, is not going to take into account all the characteristics of the economy. Because we're focusing on liquidity, are basically going to give incentive for countries to ensure that they have adopted policy to reduce their financial vulnerabilities. So what kind of criteria are we thinking about? We are thinking about the public sector borrowing requirement. We're thinking about the maturity profile of and currency composition of public debt, the extent of currency mismatches, the external financing needs of a country as represented by the current account deficit to GDP. It's very important for us, and I have to tell you that the committee spent an enormous amount of time underlying the need that this pre-qualification should need to take place on objective criteria and need to be performed by an independent office. How to create the independent office is beyond the scope of this paper, since we are just setting up the general this characteristics of the fund. But we stress that it's very important, okay? How does this fund, how does LALF get its own funding? Because we have talked about leverage, right, in addition to reserve contribution. Well, we think that the LALF should be working towards the establishment of credit lines with the U.S. Federal Reserve, the IMF, and with economies that have ample capacity to provide liquidity, including China and possible consideration to the main exporters in the Middle East. Okay? This is a fund that is being funded for the provision of liquidity to Latin America. At the regional level, we cannot ignore that the IDB and the and CAF could also provide credit lines to this LALF fund. When the global crisis hit in 2009, the two main channels of the two main channels of transmission were the sudden stop and the dry up of trade finance, sudden stop of capital flows, and the collapse of trade finance. The collapse of trade finance was unprecedented in size, as you might recall it, and basically exposed many dysfunctionalities in the global financial system. So trade credit, which is absolutely necessary for the functioning of Latin America and the world, actually, suddenly collapsed with enormous consequences for the real economy. During that time, Brazil and other countries too, but in different forms, took the lead of using public banks to step in and provide liquidity that the commercial banks were not providing to the enterprises and banks for the purpose of trade credit facilities, right? And they did that by using, in part, these credit lines, swaps that had been established with the U.S. Federal Reserve. And also, the IFC had constructed some ad hoc responses to mitigate what was such an important problem. Well, because of that experience, the committee believes that a beneficial role that LALF can play should learn from the Brazilian experience and other countries' experience that actually use the mechanism through which the LALF could establish a line to provide specifically liquidity for trade credit, and that can be channeled through public banks in member countries. Because this is the only way that can be performed. Okay, I mean, we could have a long discussions about what about public banks or not, but when we think about the possibilities, we think this would be the best. Of course, there are many issues about credibility of some public banks and all that, and we can discuss that. Additionally, and I mentioned to you that there was a third role for the LALF, and it is the fact that, as you know, the region has had an enormous, wonderful period in terms of improvement in terms of trade, right? But, and of course, that is reflected in the price of agriculture, energy, and mining sector. But the truth of the matter is that when you look at prices of commodities over a long-term scenario, or even a medium term, they are very volatile. And it has been incredibly difficult for countries. It would be natural to think, okay, so countries should have a stabilization fund for stabilizing this volatility of commodity prices. And many Latin American countries have tried. And it's very difficult, especially for political reasons, to establish one. The only exception of a fund that is working, commodity stabilization fund that is working successfully is the case of Chile. So again, learning from Chile, now, the committee believed that the establishment of a regional commodity stabilization fund administered by this LALF have a number of benefits. The first is that the legal umbrella is an international umbrella. It's not a local umbrella. And so contributes to isolate the Commodity Stabilization Fund from political pressures that come from individual countries. In addition, this regional stabilization fund could be able to take advantage of the diversification of export commodity by countries. Yes, many of the Latin American countries export commodities, but they do not export all the commodities at the same time. I mean, it's not the same kind of commodities, right? Some are oil exporters, some are copper exporters, gold exporters, okay? So there is a diversification that a regional arrangement could benefit from. Now, some of you who know the region should be asking, or maybe have been asking all the time, well, there is something in the region already. And it's called FLAR, Fondo Latinoamericano de Reserva. And it is formed by a limited number of countries. I think there are 7 now, right? okay, the 5 Andean countries plus Uruguay and Costa Rica, okay? So the committee believes that that's a very good starting point, and that FLAR, that this idea of LALF could actually be built up from something that is already established in the region. If we don't, something we don't want is to create more bureaucracy. Okay, so but but FLAR has been working very well. Indeed, we were, among our discussions, we noticed that the two regional institutions that are really regional, that have been working very well, that have very good outstanding, that have very good international classification by rating agencies, are CAF and FLAR. So they've been working well so far. So we think that that could be a very good starting point. Also, compared with the IMF and other global multilateral organization, the governance structure is much simpler. It enjoys regional ownership, something that is very important for the region now. Many countries don't even want to go to global arrangements, even if they need it, because they don't feel that the global arrangements are actually catering their own needs, even if they follow good policies. A major challenge for FLAR, because what we have done, and I hope you've been able to follow what I was trying to say, is we describe what ideally could be what the committee is saying is an effective way of operating a fund. Then we have FLAR. So how do we get from FLAR to the LA, how do we call it? LALF. Difficult. LALF sounds funny, LALF. The most important challenge is that I mentioned to you that this fund is formed by 7 countries. Neither Brazil nor Mexico are members of this group. The most important challenge is to attract these countries. This is clear to us that the LALF cannot perform the function that we have mentioned without adding these 2 countries. Now, and maybe the discussion is going to be around it because that's where the committee recommendations actually finish. We believe that strengthening FLAR along the lines discussed in the statement would be a major step toward fostering greater financial integration, and that Brazil and Mexico would benefit from that, and that there are many ways in which both countries could be attracted, but perhaps that's going to be part of what we could discuss. This goes beyond what the specific recommendations that the committee can actually do at this precise moment in time. All right. Having said that, I'm going to give a couple of minutes to any of my colleagues that wants to add or expand or clarify before I open to what we always do, which is a discussion with you. Pablo.
I want to just sort of put in context this proposal because we have in the title liquidity at times of stress. And the question is, what do we have in mind, okay? But let me just make 3 very important points. First, that institution building is best done in good times, okay? The tradition in Latin America is always to be at the center of some crisis, and then all the proposals and all the responses were responses coming out from a moment of crisis, okay? This is perhaps a very different time in which Latin America may start to think about institutions, not for the present, but for some other future context. In this sense, the second point is that the conditions, of course, of ample liquidity are very favorable for the discussion of this type of proposal, okay? And third is that especially it's my belief that the continuation of near zero interests for a sustained period of time pose large risk for the future. Okay, so the fact that we now enjoy a favorable external scenario is a situation that is really based on, in part, on the monetary policy stance taken by advanced economies, and but that situation eventually will change, either because of inflation, or because simply things get back to normal. And I think that moment of time will be a moment of time in which we'll see in many emerging markets whether really the good times have been used well or not.
It's also important to stress out, as Liliana said, the countries have been accumulating a lot of international reserves on their own for two motives. The precautionary motive, having a buffer. The other one is also perhaps to avoid strong currency appreciation in these times of strong capital inflows. For the second motive, we don't believe that this regional arrangement has anything to do with the second motive. The second motive is something that some countries may want to pursue, some others do not. But the first motive, the precautionary motive, is needed by all of them. And at this moment, some are very well covered, are probably excessively covered, but some others are not. And it's not very efficient when you think about it. It is like having savings in good times for bad times. If each one of you is saving for when you have a bad time, the total savings are much higher than if we join in a cooperative and save a lower amount each one, because in the bad times, not all of us will be hurt, and not all of us will be hurt at the same time or in the same magnitude. So this is the big benefit of joining, that you will have, because of diversification of risks in the pooling of the fund, you will need less effort for having solved the precautionary motive, and every country will be covered. Now some are not, and some are not. And this comes relatively cheap. It's about 3.5% of the total reserves in the region. It could be more than that, of course, eventually. But we are being very prudent in saying, let's begin in a relatively small way. And that's why we are proposing something that is not huge in light of the total amount of reserves. It's perfectly doable. The Asians are putting more or less this magnitude in Chiang Mai, and covers the normal needs in a normal crisis of all middle-sized and small countries, and part of the large countries. So it does a lot of jobs with a relatively small amount of money. The second comment I want to mention is the Commodity Stabilization Fund. The reason why we are putting it a little bit apart is because although it has to do with liquidity, it has to do a lot with stabilizing fiscal expenditures. Because countries that are rich in commodities derive a lot of fiscal revenues from commodities. So when the commodity price goes up a lot, if they don't have a fund to save, they spend too much. And then when the price goes down, they have to tighten a lot. So that's why having a stabilization fund is so important, especially fiscally, but also in terms of liquidity in foreign exchange earnings and access to liquidity. And the problem here is that the idea is very simple, but politically it's very difficult, because you have to tell a government, listen, you have now a lot of resources, you're going to save it for the next government, and he says, what about if the next government decides that I want to spend it all, even if I don't need it? But if a sensible government says, okay, I'm going to have the political cost to create this, and I'm going to put it in an international agreement, in a regional institution, then the next government cannot get it out as easily. So that's the big legal advantage. And the other one, as Viviana says, is you diversify. The same principle of diversification in risk, you can do more with the same amount of savings for everybody. And the last point, very small, is with, it would seem curious that we also mention as potential providers of line of credit IDB and CAF. This is not a function of IDB and CAF. They are development banks. But in practice, every time that there is a liquidity problem in the region, they are asked, and they come with special programs. And this is not their specialty. So what we are saying is, let's specialize. If this is a liquidity fund, and you are doing provision of liquidity that you shouldn't, please do it through this fund with contingent credit lines, and it makes sense from an institutional point of view. So I want to stop. Sorry, I took a little bit long.
You have to catch up. Okay, no, in the first place, I'd like to thank Liliana for organizing these meetings. I think they are extremely productive for us, at least give us a chance to exchange ideas. And I would point out that when you think about an initiative like this, a fund like this, one important role of that fund is, in the first place, to focus our minds on those issues. I mean, everybody talks about liquidity issues, but we don't have a good analysis or discussion of what's necessary. Can we do something from the perspective of the region as a whole, etc. So when discussing this, we found out that we couldn't resort to lots of material out there and say, this are the liquidity needs. We had to make up some numbers. There are some studies. I have done some studies that you can find in working papers in the National Bureau of Economic Research recently. But the issue is very much in the air. So I think that by itself, like these multinational or multilateral institutions, they always have this virtue of putting people together from different economies and countries and have them discuss these issues, which are important individually, but even just exchanging ideas is productive. So that's a general point. Now, when you look at the region as a whole, you don't have a sense. You don't come out with a sense that the region is lacking international reserves. If anything, you come out with a sense that there is overaccumulation. In our study, they are okay, but the possibility of coordinating across countries is a possibility that has to be explored, and that's what the fund initiative would do. Let me end these general remarks with one point. I agree fully with what Pablo said about the timing. It's a good time to think about this thing. Now, the time is also important because when you look at the region, you see the region slipping into deficits. I mean, these were very good times, and that's when the economies accumulated international reserves. I come out with the feeling that some of that accumulation was not because they had a little model where they figure out what the liquidity needs are, but because they have excessive liquidity coming into their coffers and they know how to spend it. So when you look at what happens in the recent years, is that the initial current account surpluses, for example, have been slipping into current account deficits, and also the fiscal position has deteriorated. So this is a good time. Maybe individually countries can do very little about that because they are under pressure, political pressure, but this is the time, and this is one of the points that was emphasized by my namesake, Guillermo III, we call him. We have three Guillermo. Yes. We have a Guillermo Che and a Che. I'm the Che Guillermo. So, but I don't want to. No. The first is actually Chapman. So no, I think it's a good time also to get our heads together and maybe sort of take advantage of a multilateral institution in order to generate these additional funds that otherwise may be dissipated going forward.
Anybody else? No?
Just to add a very short comment, most of the time our committee, our statement, more or less they tell something about Latin America and the other regions, and most of the time we are, let's say, kind of dependent on the actions of the others. And this time is an initiative that is coming out from the region. So I think the expression of maturity that is very important if you look in the future. Okay.
Okay, very well. Now we are open to all your questions, suggestions. This is supposed to be a conversation. So, who wants to start?
Let me just ask one question.
I would please identify yourself and everybody.
Yes, Franco Fornazzari. I'm a former IDB executive, so I speak with some competence of the region, not as much as you. But recently, I've been working with in China European relations, so to speak, and I noticed an amazing amount of willingness of Chinese to play a larger role internationally, which they cannot seem to be doing at the multilateral level. So tactically, there is a very interesting opportunity here. In June, I saw the Brazilian close a currency swap agreement with the People Bank of China, and I mean, obviously, China is already around 15–16% of the world trade, and they invoice only less than 1% of their currencies in renminbi. The idea that we have an independent entity in the region that can catalyze liquidity is, to me, an amazing opportunity. I just came here just to tell you that, because I normally don't go out of my way to educate people that know everything, but I thought this was a timing issue that was amazing to me. Obviously, you have an amazing role of government in the banking system of China, so it has to be a public institution that has a flavor of public interest. It cannot be a market-based initiative that can generate a lot of opportunity for making some good business, I suppose. But here, I think the public interest is overwhelming. The role of the precautionary accumulation is potentially questionable, because you sterilize a lot of liquidity, you create a lot of policy issues. If you generate a mechanism that is not captive to a number of consideration of monetary policy, of national monetary policy, I think this is an amazing opportunity.
Thank you. Let me take a couple of questions, and then we usually go by rounds. So there was another question there in the back.
Yeah, it's Jordi Zamora, journalist for Agence France Presse. My question is about Argentina. Following on, I mean, after all the events and the events that are still unfolding, I mean, a straight question, would Argentina qualify for a fund like this? And I'm thinking also of a country like Ecuador, who has defaulted personally too.
Any other question?
I have a question. How you reconcile these proposals with, for instance, some liquidity mechanisms that are already in place, like the flexible credit line of the IMF? There are two Latin American countries that have already requested, Mexico and Colombia. And why, then the question would be, why you want to go on the regional arrangement instead of focusing on, for instance, the flexible credit line? Is the issue an issue of conditionality? The main reason why we want to move away from that mechanism?
There's one more question in the back.
Hi, my name is Sam George with the Bertelsmann Foundation. The panel mentioned the importance of the larger economies to be a part of this plan. I'm curious what kind of incentives it would require for their participation, as many of these countries have strong reserves as it is and can probably access reasonable rates on international credit markets. And also, I do think this is a very good idea, and I'm curious what the next mechanism to put this in place might be, or whether that's outside of the scope of this investigation.
Any more questions? I'll take one more, and then we're going to start.
Thomas Valigno, formerly from the IMF. Two questions. One is, well, one is an observation. This idea of this fund getting a credit line from the IMF, I think that should not be very straightforward, because I don't think the IMF is, according to its articles of agreement, can lend to anybody but a national government. The second thing is, the idea is interesting in many regards, and you have expanded about it. Now, I think here the devil is in the details, and one of which is how are you going to get this independent evaluator? My concern, frankly, is that a regional organization will be even more subject to political pressure than a multilateral organization like the IMF. We always have, when those of us who have worked at the IMF periodically, this round about getting more independent evaluations done and this and that, and never comes to much, because when push comes to shove, political considerations come up, and here with countries that are closely linked by many other things, it's going to be hard. And we see that happening in Europe now, right now, when they are discussing how to help countries, and Germany has not very good reputation in Greece and all that. These things I could imagine, let's say, Argentina, someone was mentioning before, if Brazil is a member of this group, it's likely to have an important voice there. Would a negative, would Brazil be in a position to say no to that? So perhaps one way to clarify a bit that question would be to learn a bit more about this Latin American Reserve Fund that was mentioned here, and how independent that is and what has it been doing in the past. Thanks.
Okay, let me start a little bit here. Let me tell you something. The statement that you have in front of you is straightforward, I think. I mean, the questions that you are raising demonstrate that you got it, what we are writing here. But let me also make very clear about something. All the questions, absolutely all the questions that you have raised, that's what we've been spending our time, okay? Because they are very challenging questions. So I just want to clarify that the statement, rather than starting compromising, because we were considering the possibility of, okay, where we compromise here and we compromise there. Rather than starting compromising, what the statement does, it says, okay, this is the kind of region, if you're going to have a regional arrangement, this is the kind of regional arrangement that you want. That's for starters. And then, and that's why the second part is much smaller, says, okay, we have an institution that is very credible. Let's build on that, okay? Let me just go to a couple of very small things, and then I'm going to let my colleagues complement. The flexible line of credit of the IMF, we thought about that as a complement to this regional. Also, I'd like to add that a few years ago, when it was first established, I actually personally did some calculations about how much money there was in the flexible credit line. If all qualifying countries could have taken the credit line, there was not enough money. So that was not going to be enough. So that's just one comment about why the IMF flexible credit line is, one, a complement, and second, we don't think it's enough, especially for smaller countries. And the other very important question that you ask is, what about the IMF lending to regional arrangements? That's not in the statutes, and as you know, I work at the IMF too, so I know this very well. And several of us did work at the IMF, so we know that very well. Yeah, we know that, but we are not discarding that. Because we are just saying, okay, this is the menu of things that can be done. And then it will be the work of this regional institution to try to see what can be done to have access to it, as opposed to us saying, oh, it's not in the statutes now, so it's a cross. We rule it out. But we are very aware that it's not in the statutes now. All right. So I know that almost everybody has something to say about these questions because we've been discussing. Let me start with Guillermo Chapman.
I want to make a brief comment. The growing relationship with China and Latin America. You're right, sir. China has a growing interest in Latin America, and there are many reasons why they would be interested in increasing cooperation. And I would like to give you some information, additional information. China nowadays, next to the United States, is the second largest user of the Panama Canal, which looks like 5% of world trade. On top of that, the Colomb Free Trade Zone, which is the largest free trade area has re-export value in the order of $15 billion. The largest supplier of medical goods there is China. All of these goods are sold to the rest of Latin America. So probably that the originator of those goods appear at the Colomb Free Zone of China and don't appear in Latin America trade, for instance, as is work of China. So if one were to go back and recalculate the inputs that would add to the importance of China trade with Latin America. There are Chinese banks, mainland Chinese banks in Panama that finance that trade with Latin America. And on top of that, ports in the canal area are moving over 6 million TEU that are distributed in Latin America, many of which are coming from China. So there is a redistribution function there of containers coming from Asia and going to Asia, all of which are destined to, not all of which, but a good portion of which are destined to or originating in Asia, or a good part of the market. So there are many dimensions of this growing relationship between Latin America and China, which can be detected by this data.
Just complement. So I want to touch on China. I agree fully with the point that was raised. Let me first talk about a little bit the relationship with the flexible credit line. Okay. So first of all, it's clear that we look at this. We see this this institution as being complementary to the fund and not substitution. Okay. And there are, however, there are some important differences with the flexible credit line. First of all, in terms of governance, we see that there is an advantage of having a Latin American institution because it would have more ownership in the region and would probably be more predictable in terms of decisions. When you have global institutions such as the IMF, always big decisions are political, okay? And political considerations, when you have a global institutions, set precedents on what you do for Greece and what you do then for some other country in some other region, okay? So it starts to mix a number of factors which may generate some uncertainty from the point of view, say, of the capital market, which is essentially trying to evaluate, well, are these countries going to get support or not, okay? So in this sense, I think that having a Latin American institution reduces a little bit that risk. Second, we envision the pre-qualification as mandatory. Okay, so simply we get rid of the problem that first killed the CCL, the fund, and now it is making difficult for the flexible credit line to have actually countries pre-qualifying. Okay. Third, the criteria that are used for pre-qualification in our case really center on policies that have to do with reducing vulnerabilities in terms of liquidity. So we really look at providing incentives to government to reduce their liquidity needs. So it is a slightly different type of criteria than what is used in the flexible credit line, where the IMF uses more the general approach of looking at fiscal and monetary policy. Okay. And third, I think in terms of governance, we think that a regional institution can be quicker in terms of responding to needs, and so that we wouldn't have what we typically observe in financial crises, that the action of governments and multilateral institutions typically arrives too late, increasing then the size of what is needed in terms of assistance. In terms of the incentives to participate in this type of institution, it is was a major point of discussion that we had, and the fact is that for large countries, maybe one could say, well, you know, Brazil has 350 billion of reserves. Why would it care to enter into this type of institutions? Well, we see that we have seen in the region several frictions in terms of trade, in terms of expropriation of companies and interferences with the rule of law, and that have actually produced problems in the integration. Even, for instance, Mercosur, it is an example of an institution that is has been suffering quite a bit in these years. So we think that these type of institutions actually contribute to reduce these frictions and to promote regional integration. And this is probably one of the main reasons why countries such as Brazil and Mexico would like to participate. Finally, on Argentina, you know, there is sort of the operational detail whether it would pre-qualify or not, but I think that I would leave it to the institution when it is already exists. But I think that the important thing is that we are thinking it is very important that we don't start this discussion by dividing the region in these are the good countries, these are the bad countries. Okay, I think that certainly we want to have all of Latin American countries participating in the institution. There is a first tranche that is unconditional, so there is no problem. Then, of course, will come the issue of pre-qualification, and that is important to set up the right criteria, the independent, technically independent office, and then that will give sort of the operational answer relative to the second tranche. Okay, but I think that the most important thing is to really use the ownership of the region to really bring together different economies, which today Latin America is sort of being separated in two types, try to bring the region again together, even though there are different policies around.
Also, to add just a little footnote to what Pablo said, Remember that all countries have, in the first tranche, access to 100% of their contribution because it's yours. You're putting the money there, so it's for you to take if you want to, immediately, with no preconditions, with nothing. So it's very possible that you have countries that do not pre-qualify for the second tranche, meaning for the part that is leveraged, right? That is that has some risk involved. But the first part is yours. So that is not going to be the fact that you're putting the money and, oh, yeah, but you're not going to pre-qualify me for additional, not for what you have already contributed. That's just
fully agree with the comment on China. In addition to the huge interest of China in Latin America as a provider of commodity exports and as a market, because now that Europe is in recession and the US is growing slow, China is trying to diversify its trade with the emerging countries that are growing more. China has a huge amount of liquidity. So for this particular arrangement, it's clearly an interesting partner for financing. With the FLC, everything has been said, but I would mention this. The G20 has given the fund a mandate of helping develop and linking with regional monetary funds. And this is something that is being worked. People at the IMF are thinking on how to do this. I personally believe that in addition of being a complement, as has been described, the LFC by Liliana, eventually a change in statutes might make it feasible and logical that the fund gives an institution like this, LALF, can access that line. It would make all the sense in the world, because this would, in a way, it's more likely that the IMF will negotiate these kind of lines, or will with countries like Mexico and Colombia, like has happened. But it's not going to get to all the small countries in the region. It's going to be very difficult that all of them ask for the line, pre-qualify. So in a way, this is a way of wholesaling and increasing the access indirectly to a very good instrument, which we feel is an excellent instrument that the fund has. So that would take time, obviously, but it's thinking ahead is something that is possible. The issue of Brazil and Mexico is absolutely key, but just two reflections. China, Japan, and Korea have found incentives enough to contribute to the Chiang Mai initiative. And the contribution that they do is much more asymmetrical than anything that we're thinking on the case of Brazil and Mexico. They are really putting money for the others, especially Japan and China, that they are not, is not going to cover almost any amount of their needs. It's just geopolitical, good neighborhood. Here, there are more financial incentives, because this could, if it gets to the higher level that we are mentioning, it could even cover some of the needs of Brazil and Mexico. But the others are there as well. And I was telling my companions, my colleagues, an anecdote. When FLAR was created, this discussion came in Colombia. The central bank and many people said, why are we going to join this? We're not going to need this, and we're going to put it for other countries that don't behave very well. So we had a long discussion, and at the end we concluded that even if we didn't see that we were going to use FLAR for a while, at least, there would be the big benefit that those that are using it in times of liquidity crisis, we can ask them not to cut imports from Colombia. And that was a definitive reason. And there are others for this. That's why we put this sentence that we think this would help regional integration in many ways. And actually, at the end, Colombia in '99, when it had a major problem, it used FLAR in a significant way. it also came to the fund, but FLAR resources came first and were almost 40% of the resources that the IMF gave. So even in financial terms, it was eventually convenient. The devil is in the details, and you are all right. I mean, the issue of how to create an independent office that is technically strong, and there is a suggestion by Eduardo Levy-Yellati, not by us, in a paper, that you could set a first-rate competent. There are good economies in Latin America. The issue is that there is also a lot of politics. But you can create a strong technical unit with an agreement, for example, between FLAR, IDB, and CAF, that, for example, is overseen by the chief economists of these institutions. And this is only for verifying that these countries, what are the numbers and what if they are, in the end, of course, as you said, we are not naive that these things are not 100% technical. But you have to try to increase the technical input to the final decision.
Okay, Guillermo? No?
Very briefly. No, on the general issue, I can sense from the questions coming from the Tata, Malinho, and I would agree in principle that one should have some misgivings about the creation of more regional institutions, because the region has not been successful in terms of that, particularly when involving trade issues. And that can bring about a lot of inefficiencies, but what he calls it the spaghetti bowl of regional arrangements and so on, and I perfectly agree with that. But here we are dealing with something which is somewhat different, and sometimes we don't realize how different it is, and that's liquidity. Liquidity is in the eye of the beholder. Liquidity is something that involves information. So it's a different animal. How liquid are the papers, the debt obligations of a given country at a given point in time? In order to assess that, you have to know lots of things about the country. So the fact that there is a conversation going on in the region about those issues already helps a lot, and can create something which is perhaps in the end more sophisticated than what they are doing now, which is as accumulating the obligation of a third country that they all know. They don't know each other at all. So this would be an opportunity also to exchange ideas. And given that it is liquidity, I don't see this as necessarily creating inefficiency. It could actually help in creating liquidity because there is more incentives to learn about the financial conditions of each other in a region that trades with each other. And maybe the fact that they know more, it could actually encourage in a healthy way trade, instead of just subsidizing or sort of thing like that we are all concerned. So I wanted to raise that point because, of course, it's very hard to set up an institution like this. But it's not one of those things where you say, oh, you are trying now to, do something which will be detrimental to global efficiency. Actually, it could help, given the nature of liquidity, which is so different from pure trade. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Ted, I was waiting for your question. If you didn't volunteer a question, I was going to ask you to speak.
Ted Truman from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm disappointed, so maybe I will now. So, two sort of comments and then sort of two questions. One is this pre-qualification. I don't know whether you know it, but I actually proposed this in terms of the fund. You go to our website and find it, comprehensive pre-qualification for all programs as a way of doing it. Whether it's an FCL type program or we could do it along the line, everybody would have to do it. And so for example, the United States, in connection with Article 4, said, well, you would qualify for an FCL, so like your fiscal policies and some types of mess. You would have to go for a program. But I think that's a footnote you can use. And I think, and the related point, I think, is that you actually understand it right, you would pre-position financing. So you have the contributions X, right? And then you have the funding, which is 2X.
Yes,
right?
correct.
The extra X, right, in some sense. So it's not as if you have to raise the money at the time of use. That's how I read it. That is very different from some of these other kinds of mechanisms, even the way the ESFF operates in Europe. So it does a little bit of both. But I think the questions really have to do with two. One is that everybody analogizes to Chiang Mai, and it is interesting and relevant that it's never been used. And the reason why I understand it hasn't been used, in particular, for example, by Korea in the global financial crisis, was that even there's stigma. Right? So they preferred, the Koreans preferred to go, since they were admitted, if you want to put it that way, to go to the Fed, right, as did Brazil, because there is a presumption, which I think, having been there in other days, is inaccurate, that there actually is no conditions. There's conditions. I mean, there are different conditions under different circumstances, but there are conditions. Not as if drawing on a Federal Reserve swap line, right, when you actually make the drawing, is unconditional, right? The country has to vote for it, and it's something. And I put some conditions on the countries who draw on swap lines, so I know they may be less public as this over. But so there is conditional, but the point is it looks like it's completely unconditional. Now, in some sense, by your prequalification, you get around that, but I think you still have an issue of what is the signal of drawing on your mechanism convey. And I guess the other issue, of course, you have, which I'm sure you've talked about, but maybe you want to comment on, is that in many respects, even with respect to the stabilization idea component, talk the way around, you are presuming that this is all about, mostly about an external shock, external to the region, right? And those are the worst kind, in some sense, the worst kind, because that means that all the countries, more or less, will be impacted the same. Okay? So you are going to have a bit of a problem about how much you can take on. Right? I mean, you will have the same issue that the fund has, which you argued about with the FCL, right? So you can draw out collectively. In some sense, it almost doesn't work, right? So if everybody draws 100% the second tranche, right, which you repositioned, right, then no one's going to get 200%. Around the edges, who's big and who's small. So there is a little sense in which the I mean, that's a little naive. Not all crises are completely external, and many crises historically have not been. But I think I'd be interested to see to hear how you discuss that issue.
Great. Somebody else? Yes.
Hi, thank you. I am Silvia Pisani. I am from La Nación newspaper in Argentina. So, two very simple questions. I see that you have been discussing a lot about if this is going to replace or substitute or if this is a complement of the IMF. In some countries, in Argentina particularly, there's a discussion going on right now that the country can live perfectly without the IMF. And so this is a very important speech that is increasing in Argentina. So I would like to know from the panel, as you have been discussing this, if it's a good idea to live without the IMF. I mean, that's the first one. And the second one is a little bit speculative. Now we are in the door of the possibility that for the first time, so far as I understand, it never happened before, the IMF is going to apply a sanction in Argentina. It's called motion of censure. So far, I don't understand what does it mean. Each time I ask in the IMF, what does it mean? Nobody explains it correctly. So maybe you know and you can tell us. But the problem is, the key point is, do you think that this particular moment, deciding a sanction on Argentina, maybe can increase the idea that it's possible to live without the IMF, and maybe that's a good idea? Thank you.
Hold on. You have ignited fire among some of the members in the panel. So, no, very good. We like it. We like it. That's any other question?
At the time of the creation of the FCL at the fund, there was a lot of discussion about pre-qualification. And in fact, some people proposed that, and there was resistance from many countries because of the stigma of not being in the list of pre-qualified, but also because of the problem of exiting the list of being pre-qualified. How do you see that problem? And related to that, of course...
You didn't introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, Gustavo Aldo from the IMF. And the related point is, of course, if you water down the qualification criteria enough to make everybody in the pool qualified, you create another problem, which is potential moral hazard and debt dilution problem, right?
Yeah.
Which, if you draw ex post, you hurt the existing creditor. So how you create the problem ex ante? How do you see the problem, and do you see a pre-qualification feasible without creating too much moral hazard?
Yeah. Any other question? Because this is going to be our last round. Okay. Yes, please. Let me see the time.
Toshio Kimiyoshi of the IMF. One question about the objectivity of the criteria. You said that pre-qualification should be mandatory for members and should be based on objective criteria. One question is whether that criteria could be objective enough, so that we can objectively assess that this country is qualified or not. You listed some indicators and items like public sector's borrowing requirement or extent of liability dollarization ratio of current account deficit to GDP. But when it comes to assessing these sort of indicators, it requires a lot of judgment. So one can say that the current account deficit of 3% is good or not. In addition to this economic discussion, there must be some political pressure to give flexibilities to interpretation of this criteria. If you look at Europe regarding the fiscal pact, SGP, that happened in the case of Germany and France before the euro crisis. So in this sense, how can you assure that objective criteria can be objective, and how can you assess objectively these sort of criteria? That's my question.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple of things. We only have 10 minutes left. So I'm going to ask my colleagues to not repeat themselves. One we answer, well, I know everybody wants to talk, so yeah, I know. So, okay, I'm just going to take one. We have 10 minutes left, okay. Ted, I want to go directly to one part at least of your question. And it's, first of all, FLAR has been used, okay? We have a precedent in the region. FLAR has been used, and as Guillermo said, by Colombia, one of the strongest members in that group. Second, we use the Chang Meng only as comparisons because that is something that is going on and whatever, and so we use that by comparison, but we are not copying it by any means. Second, Korea, as you said, has the stigma issue. Most likely Brazil and Mexico will never use it either. It doesn't matter. We are not thinking that everybody is going to use or will want to use it. But we think that Brazil and Mexico are more systemic risk countries. They will have access to other credit lines much more easily than Colombia, Peru. So that's what we have really in mind. But the fact of the precedent, I think, is very important. Finally, your question about taking it all, right? I mean, if everybody have a crisis, we are very clear about that. We said, no. First of all, not everybody can take the same amount. We said 100% of quota or 200%. You can only take 100% of quota, but 100% of quota is your quota. So yes, you can take what you put it on. Yeah, it's the second tranche that right, but that's okay. That's perfectly okay in our scheme. In the fact that the idea is that countries like Mexico and Brazil needs to be attracted and they have to recognize that they will be net creditors. To us, that's really not the problem. The problem is, and being used, it has been used. I cannot talk too much because I know. So I'm going to give to let Roque talk because he hasn't talked. That's a good criteria.
Thank you. Well, I think that I will focus on the question about Argentina, but I will also mention some of the ideas that I have with respect to TED questions regarding this problem. The problem that we have in Argentina, but is common to many other countries, is that when you think in the working of the IMF, in the sense of asking for prior actions, asking for conditionality, and asking for all those requirements that are necessary to enact a program, in the history, that has been against the IMF because that has precluded the ownership of the program. That's in the sense that well, we are doing this because the IMF is asking for this, and we are doing that because the IMF is requiring a prior action. So everything is the IMF. And if you look at the World Bank, there's a similar sort of requirement for some of the lines that have been. So I don't think that it's a good idea to get out of the IMF in the case of Argentina. I think that we have to belong there and we have to be there. But I think that it's going to be politically difficult for the present government and maybe for the next to avoid this sort of tradition that we have that the economic program that is being done with the IMF is not an economic program of Argentina that has been imposed. And so the idea of FLAR, it has been repeated all the time about the ownership of the program. And I think that this is the new element, a very important new element in this special fund. And this also takes the problem of the stigma, in the sense that it's not going to be good or bad to sit in a table, like Guillermo mentioned, to say, look, we are having a problem and maybe we can get together and maybe Brazil or Mexico or some of the big brothers in the region can help in one way or the other. And we are not talking about conditionality and we are not talking about prior action for a program, and so it's going to be totally different. And I think that it's much easier to agree in a given program to strengthen the situation of Argentina or some other country on that special table than when you get a technician coming from Washington telling that you have to do this and that and that and that. So this is something that is working and is working well in FLAR. And if we can extend that a little bit more, I think that we are going to be creating or will be creating an institution that may be useful in the future to avoid the problem that we have in the past, like in the case of Argentina, we are going to be sanctioned because we didn't fulfill the requirement of being transparent in the production of information, index, and this and that. This is not good for anyone. It's not good for IMF either, because it doesn't make any sense to fight on this issue. I think that we will have to solve this in some other way. I agree with Ted that suppose that the crisis is over and United States increases interest rate to 6 or 7%. And then all the capital from the region maybe will go to safe assets or will have a sudden stop, let's say, provoked by the rest of the world is not providing enough or all the liquidity that we have been having in the last time. So in that case, this fund probably will not be enough. But it will help. It will help because we have been, in our statistical estimation, we took the information that we have with respect to the crisis in 2008 and 9, and with about 100 billion will help a lot, because that was the net requirement of all the region at the time. So the idea is just to help a little bit for the next crisis.
A brief comment, since I'm the Brazilian one in the table, a view from Brazil. I think the incentives to join in a program like that from the Brazilian point of view would be both economic and political. Only the economic, I think there will be a lot of discussion. But if you look at the political ones, in the stage that the Brazilian economy society is facing now, it's important to have more responsibility in South America, mainly, or in Latin America, because I think this proposal would be well accepted in the country from a political point of view.
One point, which is the one about the criteria and how objective they can be. Of course, at some level, there is always a judgment that has to be applied. But there is an important point that we are making is that the criteria need to be related to policies that diminish the vulnerability. And here you have sort of two different possible approaches. You can actually start from the policies of the country, look at fiscal, monetary, and so on, and then converge to, well, if this is done correctly, then the country is likely to need less money. We go the opposite way, namely, since this is a liquidity fund that has to provide liquidity, then let's start from the liquidity needs, which is, for instance, the borrowing requirement. The borrowing requirement is the product of, at a simple level, of three variables: the deficit, the maturity profile of the debt, and the size of the debt. By setting a principle on the borrowing requirement, you actually don't enter in the discussion of how these three factors enter in the determination of what are your needs. Now, when you have to say, well, and what is reasonable for a borrowing requirement? Well, you need to look at the market, essentially how the market is willing to finance a given, emerging markets. There is a judgment there, okay? And then you have to look at your own resources, because you want to be effective as an institution. Namely, if I can provide this much money, then I cannot provide it to a country that needs 20 times that amount, because if I do it, it won't work anyway, okay? So in this sense, you want to say, well, we want to ask countries to match in terms of policies, in terms of reducing what they need, and we can actually then be effective when we provide the resources, the liquidity resources. Okay, so this is a little bit the way in which I have always thought and actually written about it.
Yeah, I was going to address the same issue, and I would add only, I subscribe all of what Pablo has said, that you should also include whether the level of debt, of public debt, especially in foreign currency, which the government has, is sustainable. And then pre-qualification, as he asked, is not only a matter of joining the fund, but also maintaining it on a permanent basis. Should a country not meet the criteria, then it should be advised that it no longer meets the criteria, and it would only qualify for drawing the first tranche.
Third point, excellent. on Chiang Mai. The main reason why it has not been used is because in the design, initially, you can only draw 20% of what you're allowed to draw without a fund program. So countries say, well, this is very little, so we rather go directly to the fund if we need it. I think the way we have designed it has more incentives to use it first, and then if you need more, you go to the fund. The life without the IMF, for the Argentina colleague, I'm not going to talk about Argentina, but Colombia. From years 66 to 99, we had life without the IMF, and we were very happy. In 99, we had life with the IMF, and we were very happy because we have a major crisis in 99, and it was extremely useful to have a good relation with the IMF. But for 22 years, we did not have an operational relation with the IMF because we were doing things reasonably and we didn't need it. There are questions that we are not going to answer because we don't have an answer, like the difficulties in the exiting issue. I mean, there are things that this institution will have to work out, but clearly there are a lot of small details that are very complex.
Very short. Again, liquidity is very different from other things. Actually, if the IMF was really successful, nobody would have to go to the IMF. That's the idea. Right. You have an insurance there. And why would there be a speculative attack if you know that the IMF is really behind you? There are all kinds of problems with that, of course, and we are aware of that. So not having the IMF at your doorstep is good news for both, for the country and for the IMF. How you pay the salaries then is a different story.
Okay, just a final word on a couple of things. I think just to ratify this over and over again, I think I'm speaking in the name of everybody in the committee that to the question, is a good idea to live without the IMF, meaning separate yourself from the IMF, our answer is no. And second, we do recognize, without having fully solved the problem, that the long-term existence of an institution as the one we're proposing depends on the independent evaluation of the qualification process. With that, I thank you all of you and hope you join us for our statement 28. Thank you.